Hello and welcome to the ASP.NET Core Part 3. This is an ongoing tutorials for ASP.NET, and in this part we're specifically going to talk about the block database and how to set it up. I'm going to use SQL Server and a Docker container and use Management Studio to connect to it. But I will also show you how to do that just using Visual Studio, and I have shown how to do that in my previous tutorials with ADO.NET and Entity Framework. We're also going to use CRUD operations for our blog. This will be a good review of the Razor forms. The previous video that we did, we just learned the basics, but we'll learn a little bit more and how to do the data binding with that, as well as learning how to do validation on those values that's going to be coming to the database and going. Since we'll be using Razor Pages for the CRUD operations, we'll learn a little bit more about the tag helpers. Now, although we may not connect directly to our database, we'll have all the knowledge on how to do that, and we are set up and prepared once we do get to write to our database. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I have Docker installed on this system, and if we go and open up my Docker, you can see that I have the SQL Server container. So I downloaded the image, and then I ran that image, and I have a container running, and we can connect to it, but I'll show you. You can come into the docker.com, and then from here you can install Docker. It's pretty straightforward depending on what your system setup is. I use the Windows download. I won't show you how to do this because, like I said, it's a pretty simple way to do this. On Windows, you have to make sure that the Windows subsystem for Linux is installed, so you can take advantage of that. But if you get stuck anywhere, just a little bit of Googling should help you out. Okay, so once I got Docker, the next thing was to go pull the Docker image for SQL Server from Microsoft. After that, I ran the Docker command so I can have the image run and have a container set up for me. And if we go back here, this is the SQL Server. With a quick Googling, you can find that. And you can see the command here. When you run this command, it's going to get you the latest SQL Server. And it's just going to be a blank database. So since I've already got my image up and running, let's go ahead and connect to it so I can show you. And so while we're on the topic of the SQL Server Management Studio, if you do another Googling, you can come down to this page where you can install the SQL Management Studio and click the download link, and you can go through the process. Again, this is also pretty simple, so I'm not going to show you how to do that. But if you have any issues or problems with any of the Docker installation, the pulling the SQL Server, or installing the Management Studio, just ping me and I will help you out. So here I've already saved my information. Again, so I use the strongly password by having some characters. If you're going to run this, generally when you look at the Docker commands, they have double quotes. If you're going to have any in the SA password, if you're going to have any kind of a characters that cannot be escaped, then you need to put a single quote so that it can actually escape your characters for you. And if we go to this container now, if you go to this ellipse button, click View Details. This will show us all of the logs when SQL Server is ran. You can take a look at all of the logs. If we click Inspect, you can see that we ran the environment for this container, accepting the user end user license agreement. There's our password, and this is the path, and we have our TCP port. When you do run this, make sure that you bind the port between your PC and the Docker container. So now that is all done, click OK. And since we have no databases, there's nothing here, but we do have our system databases in here. So that's pretty much what I did. And also I'll show you how to do that with the Visual Studio. So there are two things here. There's the SQL Server Object Explorer, and then there's the Server Explorer. The SQL Server Explorer shows you a SQL Server, but these are the Express version of the SQL Server, and they're file-based. So if you were to open up this database, this is a file path. It is not the actual database server. So what you want to do is you want to have the Server Explorer. So if you don't have these tabs, what you can do is you can click View, and then you should be able to find the tabs in here. So here we have the SQL Server Object Explorer, and we should also have our Server Explorer over here. So here you can just click Connect, and here you would type in the name of the server, and this will be SQL Server Authentication. And then for the password, we will just go ahead and copy this. And the default database. The fact that we are able to get this means that we can actually connect using these connection properties. Click OK, or you can test the connections. We know that we already connected, so no need to test that. Click OK, and here we go. So now you get to see pretty much everything. Now there are differences between this and having the SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll keep the SQL Server Management Studios when I'm doing debugging, so I can run traces and stuff. And that's why I keep that. But if you're not going to do anything like that, and you don't want to install an additional software on your PC, just having Visual Studio is good enough. Okay, so that was part of the SQL Server setup. So there's one more piece of information I want to go over with you guys. Is if you click your Start menu, and let's go to our Visual Studio installer. And here you can see that I have the Visual Studio 22 community, and if I click Modify, I can show you what I have on this setup. So as you can see, I have the ASP.NET. Of course, this is where we get all of the templates and integration with Visual Studio. I have Python and Node development. You don't have to if you don't want to. I have some desktop development here as well. Again, those are you don't have to have those. I also have the game development for Unreal and Unity. Again, you don't have to. But the one thing that I do want to point out is the data storage and processing. So if we were to come down here and look at the section, so this actually, if we were to select this, it will highlight the selection over here where it shows you the optional information that is in here. The one thing that we are more interested in is the SQL Server Data Tools. By having this allows you that integration with the database and SQL Server. So that's basically my setup, and if you can't see any of those options, just make sure that you have the setup that I have over here with me. Now let's move on to the next topic. So in this tutorial, we'll go ahead and work with the CRUD operations using Entity Framework. To do that, I'm going to actually create a folder, and I'm going to call my folder Data. And then inside of this, I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call this one Models. And then inside of this, I'm going to create a class. So we'll choose the class. And in this class, we're going to go ahead and create the blog item. I'm going to call mine blog item, but you can call it just blog or blog post or anything that makes sense to you guys. So click Add. And then I'm going to create some properties. And the first property is going to be an identifier. So it'll be an integer and it'll be an ID. And this is going to be the ID that's going to keep track of my blog. And then the next property that I'm going to create, instead of name, I should actually call this title. That will be the title of the blog. And then the next one is going to be string as well. And then I'm going to call this one the, I guess we just can call this blog, because that would be the actual blog data. So we'll just keep this simple with these three values, and then take a look at it, see how this actually is going to help us. So now that we have a blog item, the next thing is to actually create the CRUD operations. Now we could go do this manually, but Visual Studio does give you options to have a wizard and walk you through that. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And then we're going to inspect each one of the files that it creates for us. So before we used to create either a razor page or a new item, and then you would select something. Here we're going to choose the new scaffold item. This is going to launch us into the selection page where we can create either empty, a razor page with entity framework hooked up, or we can say use the razor page using the CRUD operation. Now with this selection, if we click add, we're now going to the wizard base and it's going to ask us for what the model is. So we already have one, the blog item, and then it's going to ask us for the data context class. We don't have any, so we're going to have to create one. And then we're just going to go ahead and name our context. Instead of web application log, I'm going to actually call this blog context. And then there are some other options where we can create partial views. We haven't gone over this, so for now we're not going to choose anything. Then we have these reference script libraries. We briefly talked about this, and I promise we'll go over this once the pages are created. Next, it's going to be use a layout page. So if we go here under the shares, you can see all our layout pages that we have, and I'm going to choose the default one that was created for us and click OK. And then next we're going to click add. Now when I click add, it's going to try to create everything in the root of this page, which is fine because we're just creating this sample, and then at a later time we'll come in and manually do this so that you can get a much better sense of how to do this. So it's going to overwrite the index, which is fine. We'll just say yes. After a little while, when the operation is over, we'll see all our pages and some of the changes. Okay, so now that the operation has finished, we can see that we have this create, delete, detail, and the edit. And then, of course, we have our index page as well, where it's going to show us a list of all of the blogs. So if we were to run this, actually we would run into an error. So let's go ahead and run this to actually see the error. And that's because we have to take care of a few things before running this application. So now it has an issue where it says there's a SQL exception and it cannot open the database and the login failed basically. So let's take a look at all of the things that got created and maybe we can figure out what happened. So one of the first thing is let's go ahead and inspect to see what it did in the programs file. And as you can see here, it actually has these two lines. The first is we have the build services similar to the add razor pages. We are now adding a DB context and we're calling the blog context. So if we go to this will be very this should be familiar for you guys. So it just basically created a class and inherited from the DB context, and then it has the constructor where it has the options, and then it calls the base, which is of the DB context, and then we have a property in here, and that property is the blog item object that we created. So now that we are passing this blog context as an option, we're also saying that go ahead and use SQL Server. Now notice that's why we set up SQL Server. I'm not going to use any other databases, but if you did, you would set this option here to use whatever database you wanted. In the SQL Server database, we now have a method being called that says get the connection string from some configuration value. And then it has these little question marks, and then it has throw exception in here. So what is this? So if you had watched the previous video tutorials for C# that I've done, in one of the tutorials we went over the if else condition, and there's a short way of doing the if else. So here that's basically what's happening. What it's saying is that first go ahead, try to get the connection string from blog context. If the value that's being passed back, which is a string, if it's not null, then go ahead, just use this. If it is null, and that's what these question marks are doing, and then it says go ahead and throw an exception. So we know that the value we're getting is not null, otherwise we would see this connection or the exception that was being displayed to us. So instead, we're actually making a connection. So where do we get this connection configuration? So remember that we had this app settings.json. If we go in here, you'll notice that we just created this value, or the wizard did for us. And in here, we have a connection string. This connection string is actually using the local DB, which we showed you under the SQL Server objects. It's trying to use this SQL DB locally. Now, remember, this was the Express version file based. We're not going to use that, so we're going to go ahead and override this connection string. And how would you do this and have a connection string for SQL Server? Now, the best way to do that is to go ahead and create a text file, and we'll call this test, and then have the extension as UDL. Once you save this and try to open this by double-clicking on it, it's going to create a data link property dialog. And in here, make sure that it is the Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL, and then go to connection and what the connection properties will be. So we know that ours is going to be localhost. Then we're going to connect, not NT integrated, but we're going to use the SA password. So we're going to go SA, and then we're going to have our password in here. And we're going to also check this thing, allow saving password. Now, you may get a warning about this when we save this. That's okay, because we're going to go ahead and delete this after we get the connection string out of this. Next, it's asking us what database server we want to connect to. Because we're getting the master model, MSDB and TempDB, and we'll choose master for the default right now, we know that everything works. So if you click the test connection, it will actually show that the test succeeded. So let's go ahead and click OK. And now you get the warning about the password. Say yes. And let's go ahead and open this with our Visual Studio Code. And what we're getting is basically a file that basically has the OLEDB value here and then the connection string. So this connection string is very specific to the OLEDB provider, and that's why it has that. This using the SQL OLEDB 0.1, which is the version 1. We don't need this. All we need is everything beyond that. Let's go ahead and copy that, close this, and now let's go over here and add this for our connection. And now we have a connection, and if we run this, we're going to get to another error. And the reason is that we don't have the block database created. Now we do have the master, which we went and chose that as an option, but this is not where we want to create everything, right? So let's go ahead and just call this blogs as the database. But now we don't have a user blogs database created. And how do we do that? Well, there are some tools that's going to help us to do that. So what we can do is go to Tools and then go to the NuGet Package Manager. We're going to go to the Manage NuGet Package for the solution. And in here, we click Browse. And one of the options we want is going to be the Entity Core Design. So let's actually look for that. So it's Microsoft.entity framework.design. So once we select this, choose to install it in the web application, select install, choose OK and accept for the licensing. And once everything is installed, we can actually give it commands to for it to do something. Now before we go any further, let's actually review some other stuff. So we have all these files created. We went over the programs where it added the configuration values. And one other thing also to note is just similar to this add razor pages where it did the dependency injection, the same thing is happening here with the add DB context. Again, it's going to look like magic because you'll see that as part of the interface, similar to the logging that we were doing before in other pages. It's going to be very similar, and at some point we will definitely go and review how to create your own dependency injection objects. But for right now, I just wanted to point that out. So if you were to go to look at, for example, the index page, and we go in there, you'll notice that there's the block context as a constructor. And internally, when this is being called, because we went into the programs file and added one of these servers, the dependency injector has the contract between this, so it knows to actually get the context that it for the block context and pass that over. So we then save this into a read-only field, and then now when we are actually doing a get, we call to get the blogs and then add it into the blog item model, and then that is going to be displayed into our page. And in here we have a for each loop that will iterate through the blog item, get all of the blogs, and then display it, and then have some links to where you can do the edit, delete, and everything else. So now that we have that, so then how do we actually create the files? So one other thing to note here is before we actually use the commands to do that, I wanted to point out that there was this data file created for us. Now, for now, we actually went in here and created the blog item, right? And what will happen now is that when we run commands to actually go look at this model that was created, and it is going to read our options that was set up in the programs and the app settings, the connection string. It's going to read this blog item and then generate a database and then a table, so that the blog context is going to work for us. So if we were to go back into our programs and then go to our blog context, so our blog context is actually created in this data folder up above. So it'll use this to connect to the database and create those options. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the command we want to run is going to be add migration, and then we're going to say the initial create. And of course, I did an error. This should not be an underscore, this should be a dash. So let's run this again. So the build started, and what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and create a file for us. And this file has two methods. It has the down, and then it has the app. And if you notice the name of it, so this goes into the migrations, which is over here. So we have this migration. The name is basically based on the date, and it's basically a timestamp, and then the initial create. So this is the first time when you create your database. These are all the objects that are created for it. And then the down is when you want to revert those changes. It's going to go actually and drop those tables for you. And then we have this block context model snapshot. And this one actually has the version, and then it has the entity mapping between our database and the models that we created, and that's where this information resides. So the next step is to, but if we look at our database and we click refresh, and notice there's no database created or any of the tables. And to do that is we go back to our Visual Studio, and then from here we're just going to call the update database, and this should not be an underscore, it should be a dash. So now if we run the command, it's going to read these files and then connect to our database and create the objects for us. Now everything is done, so let's go ahead to our database, click refresh, and notice that we have our blogs database, and here we also have our blog item, and then we have all of the objects in here created for us. So by default, it created a primary key on the ID and then the title. But notice this is an nvarchar max, and maybe that's not what you want. And we'll go over later on when we manually do this to control if it's a string and we want to be a specific length that it would create that not as an nvarchar max, but to the length that we specify. We also have this thing called the EF migration history. And if we were to actually query that database table, Let's just do select star from the EF migration, and let's go ahead and execute this. We'll notice that we actually have the initial create got executed with that version. So basically what it did was it went into this initial create, ran this, and then it mapped our information, and there's the product version that it associated with it. So this is how we can keep track of what happened to our database at any one point in time. So let's go ahead and close that. So now everything should be set up. So if we run application now, it should be up and running and no issues. So as you can see now, we don't have any blogs in here, which is fine. We'll click create new, and let's actually just have some test values in here, and we'll click create. So now it went to the database and created a record, and then we went back to the index page and displayed that data. So we can go to either edit that, or we can go to the details. So we can see that in a detail page, which is very similar, but this is very for a single post. This is actually shown multiple. So if we were to create a new one and say test 2 and test 2 and create, so now we can see the list versus if we were to go to the detail, we just see just the information for this blog. Or we can click delete, that would delete it from our database. So this is really a simple way to create the CRUD operations. But again, this kind of is going to look like magic, even though we went kind of over it a little bit. Because if you were to go to the actual pages themselves, so let's actually do the create page. And if we go in here, so we have actually everything created for us. We have the labels, we have the inputs, and then we have this thing called validation. And we'll go over what these validation are. And this is actually all inside a form. And when we click the submit button, it actually will post back to itself. So then we come in here to the code behind, and then on post, and this is being handled asynchronously because we have the async keyword, and then we have then await inside of this, and then we have some code that's being checks to see the validity of the state of the model. And then we add the blog item to the context, and then we call the save changes to push that data into the database, and then we do a redirect to the index page, which is the home page, the default page where we see the list. So this is how the wizard went and created everything for us. And this should be a good review of what the wizard did for us. But now let's go ahead and look at this a little bit more in depth of the actual tag helpers, which is these guys here, and what they are and how to do this ourselves. So we're going to create a page that's going to do all that for us. Now, one other thing to note is that I did mention I was going to go over this validation partial script and what this is. So remember that previously we talked about if we were go to, for example, in the pages and the shared, we have this thing called validation script partial.cshtml. So this is basically just another Razor page, but in this Razor page, all we have is the scripts. It could have other things in here, it could have some HTML and stuff. That's not a problem. But in this case, we only have the scripts. And then in here, we have a section where we're saying, calling this scripts, and we're saying render this partial page. So just as you had these Razor pages where it has some HTML, you can have partial pages so that you can insert those partial values, kind of like controls, as part of your page itself. And we'll go in detail what those scripts are. So that's basically the validation that it's going to be doing. So let's end this here, and then we'll take a look at all of the validation in creating a example, manually create all of this ourselves. So in this section, let's talk about the HTML tag helpers. So here we have our index page, and if we execute it, we'll get to see our index page where it has a listing of our blogs, and then we can edit them or look at the details or delete them. So now let's take a look at how the data was rendered in our HTML page and how the tag helpers were helping. So in here, if you notice now we have some C# code here, and then we have some HTML. We also have a few other C# code in here. These are actually HTML helpers. But then in the, if you look at this the HTML tags, you'll notice that the color coding is a little bit different than this HTML tag. There's no C# code in here. Because otherwise it would be denoted with the @ which is the directive for that. So we're not seeing anything like that. But if we bring our cursor on it, notice that it is recognizing that this is a tag helper for the ASP page. And basically, this is generating a anchor tag, which is the HTML way of creating a link. And if we go back to our index page, you'll notice now we have a link. If you bring your cursor on it, you can see here that it's pointing to a correct page, which is creating a blog post. So if we were to inspect this and look at the HTML, let's move this down a little bit. So if we look at this, now we have an anchor tag with an href, and it has a path, and then a text that has the link description. So what we did was basically use this tag helper that the page recognized, and then it generated an HTML link for us using just this word create. Well, how did it do that? So this index page, notice that we went over that when you go to the browser and you give it a URL, the request goes to the server, and the server maps it to a Razor page. And when it does, it goes ahead and executes the model for it, which is this page in here. And then we, of course, execute a onGet async or an onGet. And here, all we did was we get all of our blog items and assigned it to the blog property over here, which has a list of our blog item. And then when that request is executed, then the code behind for this page is executed. This actually goes to an engine that will render HTML for us, and that is the Razor engine. And this is why this is a Razor page. So the Razor engine goes over here, so we can recognize this is an add page directive. So it's a Razor page. And then we are using the index model, which is the code behind for our model that we're going to use. We'll go over what this view data and some temp data and some other stuff is. These are basically properties of the page handler, and well, again, we'll go over all of those in later sessions. And then the Razor engine will go through and sees the HTML. So it will render the HTML, it'll come to the p tag, and then it'll come into this anchor tag. But inside of the anchor tag, it will recognize, and we know this because the color coding changes from the HTML way of color coding to this tag helper. It's more pronounced, which is bold, and the color might be a little different as well. So anyway, when it recognizes this, internally, it's going to go ahead and execute a piece of code that will generate the href for us. So that's how the tag helpers work. And then, of course, we go through and execute the rest of the HTML, rendering that, and then we come into the C# code, which is the HTML helper. So once these are all executed, we come into our for each loop, we keep iterating through, and we display some more information to the user. And that's how we get this page rendered. So the request is going to take this piece of code, generate HTML, and then send it back to the browser, and then the browser, of course, displays this. So now you're probably wondering why we have these tag helpers versus the HTML helpers. Are they not doing the same thing? There isn't really a one-to-one mapping between the tag helpers versus the HTML helpers. I believe when I was working with ASP.NET Core when it first came out, everything from what I can remember was just HTML helpers. And then at later points of the, I'm not sure what version of ASP.NET Core, it might have been a version 2 or 3 that the tag helpers were created. And the major difference you can see is this is more a C# way or centric way of doing something versus this is more HTML. And it's a little bit more clear when you look at this versus something like this. So that's the main differences that you can see. You can choose which ones you want to use depending on your situation. But generally moving forward, we'll try to use the ASP.NET tag helpers going forward. So if you come in here, notice now we have another anchor tag here. And inside of this anchor tag, of course, we have this thing ASP page. Well, how does it generate this create link that goes into our Razor page or these links over here? So when we talked about the routing earlier on, the ASP page, because it's a link to a Razor page, it's taken it looks for the routing that we have to generate this link. So what happens when you try to give it an incorrect page, and how does it handle that? Now let's go back to our shared data and look at our layout. So this is the layout that our page is using. And if you come over here, notice that in the div section here, when we're generating this page for index and privacy, which is basically these two links that we're creating on top, it also has the ASP page in here. This link actually has some additional information. We're given the styling of this. We also have something else called an area. We haven't gone over areas yet, and we will at later tutorials. But because we haven't, we specified it, but we're not passing anything, so it'll just be clear. There'll be nothing there. So then we give the ASP page. And what the routing is going to do is going to go look for this route and generate a link for it. So now let's go ahead and take one of these links and make this into something that doesn't exist. We'll call it foo, and let's change this to foo as well. So we have to actually do a hot reload for that to take effect, and refresh, and now we have our foo link in here. Now if we click on this, we didn't go to a page foo that doesn't exist and then get this broken section saying document not found. And if you bring your cursor on it, it's actually going to the root of the page. So what ASP.NET did was it looked for this route and it didn't find it. Since it didn't find this, it is navigating us back to the home page, basically to the root of the application. And if you bring your cursor on it and then we go to inspect and look at this, you notice that there is no href for it, so therefore it is pointing back to the web application root. So if you were to do this in HTML versus doing the tag helpers, then what you would do is that you would actually map to a page that doesn't exist, and it would be a broken link. So when you have your website up. One of the reasons you probably want to use the tag helpers is that it's a little bit more generous and trying to not create a route that doesn't exist. And so when you have Google or some other search engine coming in to search your site, there are no broken links, and therefore your page will not get ranked incorrectly because you have broken links on your page. Now there's a lot of tag helpers that you can use, and we're not going to go over every single one of them because it would just be too much information. So we'll just go ahead and use these tag helpers whenever we go create our pages, which will be in the next tutorial. So that way you learn as we use them and why we're using them as we are. So now let's talk about validation. So here we are in our application, and if I go to create a new blog item, and when I click create, I'm presented with a error message on these fields saying that they are required, meaning that I have to have a value for them. So this validation happens actually on the client side, meaning it's happening on my browser. So if we click inspect and go to our network, and actually let's refresh this page and clear this. So now if I click again, you'll notice that there was no network request made here. So that was on the client side using jQuery. So now if we go to our application and we go to our create, now that validation happens because we have our data binding happening on these HTML tags. So we have our label and we have our input, and then we have a span. And this span, we have the ASP validation for the blog item title. Then we have the same thing for the actual blog. And then we have our input. So when you are submitting the form, then the validation occurs. This validation occurs because we are rendering this section with scripts, which will go to render this partial page, the partial razor page, which is our validation script partial. And if we go to our shared, we can see that this is the two scripts that are required in order for that validation to happen. So if we go back here and go to our elements and we scroll down, we can see that these are the two scripts that was part of that. Now what I'm going to do is actually go back here, and let's go ahead and stop our application, and I'm going to comment this out. And once this is commented out, when we save this and rerun our application, we should not have any validation occurring on the client side because we've disabled the scripts. The jQuery validation are no longer in play. And when we click submit, the submit will actually go to the server. So let's go back here and let's take a look at our inspect. Go to our network. Now before submitting this, I'm going to put a breakpoint to our code behind on the post. And now I'm going to click submit. So notice that this time now we actually send the request. And if we look at the model state, it is false, meaning that there was no validation. The validation is not correct. And if we step through this, we're just going to return the page, and this page has a page result, which is inheriting from the iAction result, and that's what we're returning. We will go over all of this and what this is, but we'll do that in later tutorials. So for now, what we're just basically doing is rendering the same page, and now we see validation errors that are being displayed. This validation error is being displayed because in the CSS HTML we have these tag helpers for validation that help us. So now if we were to go into the element section for this, let's inspect that. So now we can see that the span have this value that is required. Now if I was to delete this, the validation error goes away. So by having the value printed here, and it's done internally by ASP.NET Core, that validation happens for us. So there's the client-side validation, and then there's the server-side validation to happen by checking the model state is valid. So the reason you would want to do validation is that if we go to our database, and if we go to our tables and we go to the design of our blog item, the title and the blog do not allow nulls. So if we were to accept those nulls and not do any validation, they would generate a SQL exception error, and there will be unnecessary processing that happens in network round trip that we don't need. So that would be one reason. There are other reasons for security and other issues that might come up by not doing this. So this is why you would want to do validation. It's strongly recommended that you always do validation. So now that we've gone over that, now let's take a look at how this validation actually happens. So we'll do this on the server side first. What we're going to do is create a test page, and I already have a test page here. And this is basically very similar to the previous page that we looked at, almost exactly the same, except we have a test model, and the test model has a title and test data. We still have the same submit button, and we have our script partials being rendered. So if we go to our code behind, here now we only have just an if statement to see if is valid, and then we return a page. Now we could actually omit this and turn this into void, and it would also work. So again, we'll go over all of that. So we'll keep this very simple as having similar to the Git and just doing this validation. So now that we have this, let's actually take a look at the property that we have for a test item. And now if we go over here, so now we have our class with the properties, and we actually have this question mark in front of the string. So this question mark actually denotes that this is a nullable property. If we were to take this out, then what would happen is that this would be non-nullable, and the ASP.NET Core will actually apply validation for you. And it will internally, and it will treat it as if you had an attribute saying that do validation for this. So let's remove the question mark for now and save that, and then make sure that we have everything set up correctly here. So we have our input, and we have our label for that, and then we have our validation tag helper, and then we have our jQuery. So now if we run this project, and then navigate to the test page, and we do the inspect and go to our network. Now, because we have the jQuery stuff set up, we actually should not get a network round trip, and we should see the validation errors, and we do. Next, what we want to do is comment this out. Let's go ahead and comment this out. So now it will always do a server validation for us, but now we're going to do a quick hot reload. So now let's go ahead and clear this. So if we submit, we just did a server request, and we can see that because that's our request over there. And of course, we have a breakpoint hitting it. Now, if you look at the model state is false, meaning that the validation did not pass. So we continue, then go back, and now we see the validation message being inserted for us by the tag helpers when the page was rendered. So that actually happened on the server when the page was being executed, and it inserted those validation for us and then rendered at HTML. So now if we go to our test item and make these nullable and save this and do a quick hot reload and continue, and let's clear this. So now if we click submit, we have our validation state false. Actually, let's go ahead and stop this and relaunch the application. I don't think the hot reload worked quite well. So let's actually make sure these are null. Yep, they are. So now we're back on the page. Let's go to our test page and let's go to the inspect, go to our network. Let's close this and click submit. So now the validation is true. The reason the validation is true is because now we have both of these allowed as nullable. Oops, now actually let's stop this. So now why is this nullable state that is happening? This is actually due to the project settings. So if we were to right click and go to his properties, we see all the project properties that we have in here. So if we check for nullable, and you can see that it's specified there's a value or property within the project file that allows the nullable context. And again, if we were to go to the web application in here, you can see that that nullable is enabled. So this generally happens with later version of C#. I believe it's version 8. So if you have your .NET Core using .NET Core 6, by default, the template will have this enabled. That is why this enabled value is turned on. And that is how this is working. So there are other attributes you can do to help this. So if you do want to treat this as non-nullable, but then you want to have values in here to say an attribute, for example, to validate never. And what will happen is that, let's put this on both of these. And now it's going to treat it as even if you had null values, it will not do validation for you. So let's go ahead and run our application again. And let's go to our test page. And this time, if we were to click, let's just go to inspect, go to our network, let's close this, click create. And now, as you can see, our validation is true, even though our test item do not have the nullable question mark here. But because we have these attributes, ASP.NET is able to treat the validation as accepting null values. So that's something that happens internally within ASP.NET. So these attributes are basically, we haven't gone over attributes in previous tutorials. Attributes are basically a little decorated that you can put. You can put attributes pretty much on any, whether it be a class, or it be a property or a method. You can have these attributes, but those attributes by themselves don't do anything. The ASP.NET Framework is smart enough to look at this class and look at its properties and read these attributes and then take actions on them. So it's important to note that if you start putting attributes on things outside of ASP.NET and you don't see the expected behavior, that is because you have to handle and deal with that, or the framework that you're running as should take care of those. So hopefully this made sense for the validation. Now, we didn't go quite over the HTML side of things where this jQuery stuff happens. So let's just briefly touch base on this let's go ahead and uncomment this. Let's go ahead and stop our project, uncomment this, and then go to our test item and actually make these so they are required. So I can save this. So now this time when we run our application, we do expect the validations to take place. So let's go to our test page. So, and then we will go look at our network. So now we didn't make a network and everything was done on the client side. So how did this actually work? Well, if you read the documentation and if you do quick searches for the jQuery .validate.js, we're using the minified version here. then also the unobtrusive .js file for the validation and jQuery. These two scripts are responsible for doing this validation, and how it does that is by looking at the HTML that is supplied within the input fields and then act on them. So if we were to take a look at this input, which is our title, as you can see that we have a style here, and then we have the type, which is text, which is a text box, and then we have this thing called data-val. And basically this is what denoting that this requires the validation equals true. And then the data validation required is the string that you see over here. So if we click submit, this is the string that we displayed in the span that will denote that there was an error. So if we click submit, as you can see that is the field that gets inserted as into the span, and that is what generates this message in here. So that's basically how it happened, and this is a very quick and brief overview. And in the next tutorial, as we go to build our blog, much more in-depth tutorials into actually how to do this and setting up the admin pages and security and deployment and stuff, we'll really dive deep into all of this and kind of figure this out. Hopefully this was a good starting point for you to start your development on ASP.NET, and then now learning everything that you have in part 1, part 2, and part 3 will help us in part 4, where we will start actually coding a real world application.